We now continue with substances and substrata, part 2. Now, one of the ways that metaphysical battles are conducted is weighing the cost of a theory versus its benefits, and then weighing those against the cost and benefits of another theory. So as I mentioned, we talked about methodology. Essentially, it's a battle of economy versus advantage. And of course, there's a question of whether something provides a real, economic advantage versus not doing so. Now, on the face of it, the bundle of tropes view could be seen as more economical, cheaper, than a trope substrata view. This is because, going back and looking at like Occam's razor, etc., the trope substrata theorist has to accept at least two distinct ontological kinds, namely tropes and substrata. So you get two things in the theory. The bundle theorist is committed to only one, namely tropes. So this economy, this relative cheapness, would seem to give the bundle view an initial advantage. It seems to be ahead at this point. But it's only an advantage if the economy is a true one rather than a false one. It is, of course, my contention that the apparent, value of just going with tropes and no substrata is a false economy. So, the regress argument for substrata involving objects. So suppose we have two objects, and again, because variables are cool, and also Greek letters as variables, extra cool, our first object will be object sigma, and suppose for the sake of simplicity that it has tropes A and B, whatever they might be. Then object delta, which has tropes C and D. So basically imagine we got two objects. We could have like object sigma, say be a sandwich, and it's got two particular qualities like roast beef and bread. And then object delta could be like another sandwich, and it could have say hot dog and bun. Now, the existence of the tropes A, B, C, and D is by itself not enough to account for sigma being A and B and delta being C and D. Because without something grouping the tropes, there'd be no higher order entities like objects. Objects, it would seem, are more than just loose tropes. Tropes organized and grouped together to form complex entities like tables, electrons, and galaxies. So you need something more than just the tropes, because otherwise you just have a bag of tropes. Again, to use kind of go back to the sort of like sandwich and hot dog analogy, if you just like threw some roast beef down and some bread and a hot dog and a bun, and just had them laying there, you need something more than those things to have two distinct sandwiches. Now the metaphor, of course, breaks apart pretty quickly because you could just shove the roast beef into the bread and put the dog into the bun. But the idea is you have to have things grouping together. So the something more, of course, is going to be the substrata. Next argument. The regress argument for substrata, the bundle option. So suppose we agree that you just can't have loose tropes. In order to have objects, something has got to group them together to form objects. So we could present a sophisticated bundle theory, which doesn't have these loose tropes. It has tropes that exist within bundles that somehow form higher order entities. Again, going with a bad metaphor, they form sandwiches. So what is this something more which binds tropes together? Well, there's one very critical limit. It cannot be an additional ontological kind. Why? Well, if it were, then we'd end up being essentially the same cost as trope substrata. Because the whole point of the bundle theory is economy. It's supposed to be cheaper. Now, the bundle theorist essentially has two main options to avoid accepting an additional ontological kind, to get the ordering of tropes without accepting another metaphysical entity. So here's the first option. We'll call it bundle option 1. So the bundle theorist can deny that the binder of tropes has any real being, although they need tropes to be bound into bundles and organized into highly complex entities. So what's the problem with this? Well, this approach denies the reality of something that is an active role, and so runs contrary to what Plato called the mark of being, which is a principle of metaphysics that answers the question, how do you determine what is real? And Plato said that anything has real being that is so constituted as to possess any sort of power, either to affect anything else or to be affected, and however small a degree, by the most insignificant agent, though it be only once. A mark to distinguish real things is this: they are nothing but power, which seems reasonable. So, in contrast, though, it seems unreasonable and uneconomical to postulate entities incapable of doing anything or having anything done to them. Because if someone postulates something and you ask them, what does it do? And they say, nothing. What's done to it? And they say, nothing. The fair question to be is, well, what is it? If it does nothing and nothing is done to it, what is it? And the fair answer would be nothing. Now, it is reasonable to accept that anything which can affect or be affected must be real. Because if someone says this thing's doing stuff or stuff can be done to it, that would seem to make it real. So the binding and ordering of tropes together to form complex entities do seem to be instances of effective activity. Things are being done. So, I argue, a real binder should be accepted. Now, to assume the binder must be a substratum, because a substratum is, by definition by definition a binder of properties, would possibly be begging the question. So we can't simply assume this. Why? Well, because even though a substratum is a binder of properties, it's not simply a binder of properties, but is a non-property binder of properties. So in this context, a substratum must be a non-trope binder of tropes. Rigorous argument for substrata bundle option 2. Now, a bundle theorist can say, okay, real beings are involved in the binding of tropes. Okay, they accept Plato's mark of being. But they can also say, but this is not a substrata, none of that substrata stuff. So the bundle theorist would argue that there are possibly binding tropes, which serve to bind tropes together. Now, because binding tropes are obviously tropes, the bundle theorist would retain their initial economic advantage. They would just have tropes. It is, as I've argued previously, unreasonable to accept that tropes can exist singly, just on their own, like a single pitch trope or mass trope. And there is a need for a real binder to bind tropes to form substances. So it follows that binding tropes must also be bound by tropes. But, and you probably suspect an infinite regress is coming up here, and you'd be right, if each binding trope must be bound by another binding trope, an infinite regress will arise. And this regress creates two serious problems. And you probably recall an infinite regress occurs when, in order to have A, it requires B, which requires C, which requires D, which requires E, on to infinity and possibly beyond. So the problems are these. The first one is that a binding between any two tropes will assume the binding of other tropes, which presupposes the binding of other tropes, and so on to infinity and beyond. Yeah, the classic infinite regress. For example, for A and C be bound by binding trope B1, B1 must be bound to A by binding trope B2, and to C by binding trope B3, and B2 must be bound to A and B1 by B4 and B5, and so on into infinity and beyond. So, with this infinite regress, throwing a reductio ad absurdum, the binding of tropes cannot occur because no binding can ever be successful. This leads, of course, to the second problem, which is, even if bindings were to occur, there'd be an infinite number of binding tropes for each binding, which would be uneconomical. Now, of course, a clever bundle theorist could say, okay, yeah, there's an infinite number of these tropes, but they're still just tropes. We just have an infinite number of them for every binding, which would be economical in the sense of they just have tropes, but would be kind of weird. So the only way it seems to stop the regress and avoid these problems is to accept a unbound binder, a binder that need not be bound itself. Since tropes cannot exist singly, it is unreasonable to accept that binding tropes need not be bound. Because if tropes did not need to be bound, there'd be no need to accept binding tropes. Now, a bundle theorist could try claiming that binding tropes, unlike all other tropes, need not be bound. But this would be what we call in the philosophy business ad hoc. Just essentially, presenting a solution because it is the solution without any other justification. So unwarranted, which would be bad. Now, if binding tropes are so very different from other tropes that they can do this and sort of break all the trope rules, one might suspect that they are a different ontological kind. These so-called tropes might be substrata in disguise. So those problems seem pretty problematic. Now, to the regress argument for substrata, the problem for trope substrata theory. Yes, I do use a lot of regress arguments because they're pretty handy in arguing in metaphysics. Now, in the trope substrata view, the view, spoiler, that, disclaimer that I accept, tropes are bound together by substrata. Now, problem arises. What binds tropes to substrata? Well, the binding between tropes and substrata cannot be a trope, because we get that infinite regress. You need a trope binding the trope, binding the trope, binding the trope, binding the trope, to infinity and beyond. So a trope substrata theorist must take the binding between tropes and substrata to be a primitive. Now, going back to our discussion of methods in metaphysics, taking something as primitive, undefined and analyzed, is a legitimate move, because you can't analyze forever, to infinity and beyond. However, there's a cost to it. So honesty requires that one say that if it takes something as primitive, there's a price to it. So what the bundle theorist could try to do is say, well, my binding tropes are primitive, and they're still tropes, and they bind, and the problem is solved, and they could seemingly retain an advantage of economy. They just have tropes. But the problem would be, once again, is this would seem to be ad hoc. Why? Well, binding tropes are tropes, and it seems unprincipled to claim that it is just a brute fact that they have a special status, distinguishing them from all other tropes. The only reason to accept this would be to avoid the problem, which would be, by definition, ad hoc. Now, what if someone says, hey, when you accept substrata, aren't you just being ad hoc when you say they don't need binding tropes? Well, here's why. It's not ad hoc to claim that substrata don't need to be bound like tropes. Why? Well, because substrata are, unlike binding tropes, not tropes. So a price is paid to avoid the regress. And the price is that you have to accept these primitive bindings, whatever they are, which somehow bind tropes in substrata. But the price that one pays for it is you accept substrata. So it's not ad hoc, it just comes at a price. But if someone just says, these tropes are special tropes, they don't need to be bound, it's all primitive, that comes at a price, but is also rather ad hoc. Now, this, of course, could all be debated. Someone could say, well, it's no more ad hoc than doing this substrata binding stuff, and it has the advantage of economy, and that battle could be waged as well. So, the regress argument for substrata bundle option once more. Now again, the bundle theorist can say correctly, it seems more economical to take the binding of tropes to form substances as simply primitive. This, of course, would seem to require rejecting Plato's mark of being, or at the very least providing arguments that there is no need to accept a real being to account for binding. The problem is that Plato's mark of being seems rather plausible, and that it seems reasonable to accept the need for a real binder, given the arguments that have come before, so such a view would seem to be not very plausible. So that would seem to be quite a problem. The Australian philosopher David Armstrong argued in favor of immanent universals, but he also argued in favor of substrata, and he argued against trope bundles. So in his work Universals, he contends that the trope substrata view is better than the bundle of tropes view, but he still contends that his own view, immanent universals, is better than these others. So his view is kind of like trope substrata is not as bad as bundles of tropes. And his reasoning is that tropes are not suitable to be substances of the world. For example, in the case of relations, like being taller than or being the father of, it makes no sense to speak of relations existing apart from what they relate. And property tropes, as he saw it, cannot be substances, since tropes are not the sort of entities that can exist singularly. So, for example, to use his example, a particular mass could not exist on its own. It'd be odd just to have like a reality where there's just a single mass trope with no other qualities. So what bundle theorists often do is give their tropes spatial and temporal characteristics, as well as shape, duration, and size. And to quote Armstrong, not translated because he's Australian, so wrote in English, the theorists are then embarrassed because shape, size, and duration appear themselves to be properties, and therefore ought to be tropes alongside other property tropes. So he concludes that tropes will not do as substances. Now, this is as problematic for a single property binding substratum, as he notes. A substratum with one property is not much more substantial than a single trope. So if a particular mass, trope cannot exist on its own, a substratum with only a single mass trope cannot exist. So while a single trope is not suitable as a substance, he notes, neither is a substratum with a single trope. So a substance will have to be a robust, complex entity. On the bundle view, multiple tropes. On the substrata view, multiple tropes plus a substratum. Continue with Armstrong. He raises two questions. The first question is this: what constitutes a minimal substance? Put in sort of grandiose terms, what is the minimal universe you could have? What could you have that's the least of things? This, of course, goes way beyond the scope of this paper, so can't answer that. Well, don't answer that. Question 2. What is it that programs the binders to form these minimal entities? This question is like the question about determinables and determinates. There are necessary connections at the level of determinable, level associated with contingency between determinates. For example, sounds have volume and pitch that can vary independently, but every volume must have some pitch, and every pitch must have some volume. As another example, shape and size, every shape must have a particular size. Purity and hues of color, etc. And so we can find things that involve determinables and determinates. Now, there is, according to Armstrong and many others, no account of why properties cannot exist singly. And there's no reason why this account would tell against tropes. So Armstrong's first argument does not tell against bundle theory in favor of a substrata view. However, what it does do is indicate the need for robust substances. So now we can turn to Armstrong's argument for substrata, his second argument. So Armstrong's second argument rests on an assumption of second-order properties. On a trope view, First, second, and higher order properties are tropes. Armstrong asks, what would it be on the bundle view for a first order trope to have a second order trope? And he asks if it should be accepted that a first order trope is only a bundle of properties. Armstrong says, to quote him, this is very unattractive, and claims, to quote him, that a substance attribute model of the relation of a first order trope to its property seems much more inviting. So if a trope counts as a substratum vis-a-vis its second order properties, then why not adopt the substratum attribute model at the base level as well? So if Armstrong is right, a trope substrata view should be accepted over a bundle of tropes view. Now, one of the classic objections against substrata is the empiricist objection. So, a motivation for accepting a bundle view over a substrata view is the weight of problems with substrata. Again, going back to our methods of metaphysics, if you can show there's all kinds of problems associated with accepting substrata, then those are big minuses to the theory that accepts them. So these problems would need to be addressed. So what is the classic empiricist challenge against substrata? Well, the stock empiricist argument seems to have first been presented by our good dead friend John Locke, then by our good dead friend George Berkeley against material substance, and then by our good dead friend David Hume against both material and immaterial substance. Now they use the term substance rather than substrata, but their attacks were on the supporter of properties, so you could swap in the terms substrata just fine, because they meant supporter of properties. So what is this empiricist argument? Well, here's how it goes. The first harsh version. First premise, whatever is known about things is known in terms of, or by means of, their properties. Since substrata are the binders of properties and not properties, they cannot be known. Since they cannot be known, to posit the existence of substrata is to engage in unjustified speculation. So this should not be done. And so the basic idea is that, to put the argument a little differently, if you were to, take like a folder, take a manila envelope folder and peel away all the properties, the shape, size, density, mass, volume, etc., what would you be left with? And the answer, of course, would seem to be nothing. Now, what about the milder empiricist argument? Well, here's how that goes. Properties are understood and experienced every day. We encounter, color, shape, mass, density, volume, etc. And what is supposed to bind these properties is not well understood, and we never seem to experience them. They are mysterious sorts of entities. Hence, the mysteriousness of substrata provides a reason to reject them, and at the very least, raises their cost. So how can we reply to this problem? Well, one reply is to try to have knowable binding tropes. So you could argue a substratum has a property of binding properties by which it may be known. This leads to a regress we saw before. So suppose there are binding tropes that substrata possess, and that tropes need to be bound by substrata. Since binding tropes are tropes, they need to be bound to the substrata. The initial binding trope would have to be itself bound to the substratum, and the trope that binds it would also have to be bound, and so on to infinity and beyond. Since the binding of trope n, where n is some number, to a substratum depends on the binding of trope n plus 1, that number plus 1, to a substratum and so on, tropes can never be bound to a substratum since the required initial binding requires an infinite number of steps. So infinite regress plus absurdity makes it impossible. Now, even if we said, okay, binding could occur somehow, each binding would require an infinite number of binding tropes, which is problematic because you get lots of binding tropes. Hence, binding tropes should not be postulated, and the binding capacity of substrata should be kept as a primitive. The problem, of course, is this would not answer the empiricist challenge, because taking them as a primitive does not beat the empiricist objection that we don't seem to experience them, so we have no reason to believe they exist. Fortunately, our good dead friend Descartes has a way to reply to this. So what's Descartes' reply? Well, in the Principles of Philosophy, Descartes addresses a very similar challenge. He needs an account of how substances may be known. And he claims we cannot initially become aware of a substance through its being an existing thing, since this alone does not of itself have any effect on us. We can know a substance by one of its attributes, because, he claims, nothingness possesses no properties or qualities. So if we perceive the presence of an attribute, we can infer there is a substance to which it may be attributed. If it is known that properties cannot exist without existing as a property of a substance, and it is known that properties exist, it can be inferred that substance exists. While substance cannot be known directly, they can be known by inference. The reply for substrata. So if only properties can be known, then direct knowledge of substrata would be impossible. However, substrata could be known by inference. Tropes cannot exist singly, and they need to be bound by substrata to form substances. If that's true, when the presence of a property is perceived, it can be inferred there must be a substratum present to which it is bound. Thus, substrata can be known by inference, and the empiricist counter is, the empiricist challenge is countered.